Hey, welcome back. Get comfortable. Seriously, take a second and actually get comfortable. Move your pillow if you need to. Pull your blanket up. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. There, that's better. Tonight, we're going to talk about pioneer women on the Oregon Trail. Now, before you picture anything, I want you to stop because whatever image just popped into your head, it's probably wrong. And that's not your fault. That's Hollywood's fault. If you've seen any movie or TV show set on the American frontier, and there are a lot of them, you've probably seen a very specific version of pioneer life. You've seen women in calico dresses running dramatically through tall grass. You've seen covered wagons racing across open plains while somebody fires a rifle. You've seen confrontations and speeches and moments of big, important drama. And look, those movies aren't lying exactly. Some of those things happened, some of the time, to some people. But here's the thing about drama. It's not what most days looked like. Most days on the Oregon Trail, and most days in pioneer life in general, were slow. They were repetitive. They were full of small, quiet tasks that nobody ever thought to write a movie about. Because who's going to watch 2 hours of a woman carefully mending a sock by firelight? Well, you are, tonight, because that's exactly what we're here for. Tonight, we're going to look at the real, quiet, everyday truth of what pioneer women actually did. Hour by hour, task by task, day by day, the whole long, slow, surprisingly peaceful rhythm of it. We're going to talk about mornings, about what it actually felt like to wake up in a covered wagon or a canvas tent before the sun came up. We're going to talk about food, real food, not the romanticized stuff. The actual beans and cornmeal and dried salt pork that showed up on the plate day after day. We're going to talk about the work, the constant, endless, meditative work that kept a family alive on a 2,000-mile journey. And we're going to talk about the evenings, the quiet ones, the ones that looked nothing like a campfire scene in a movie. Because the truth is, and this is the thing I love most about real history, the truth is that ordinary people living ordinary days are way more interesting than Hollywood gives them credit for. Not in a dramatic way, in a quiet, grounding, deeply human way. These women weren't just background characters in somebody else's adventure story. They were running households, raising children, making thousands of small decisions, and doing it all while walking 2,000 miles through the wilderness. And they did most of it without any fanfare at all. So let's slow down together and look at that. Let your body settle a little more into wherever you're lying down right now. Let your arms go heavy. Let your breathing get a little slower. Tonight is going to be calm. Tonight is going to be quiet. We're going to move through this history the same way those women moved through their days, steadily, without rushing, one small moment at a time. And by the time we're done, you'll know the real story. The one they don't put in the movies. The one that's somehow more beautiful for being so ordinary. Let's begin. Now, before we go any further, let me give you a little bit of context, because this story only makes sense if you understand why it was happening at all. The Oregon Trail became the main overland route to the Pacific Northwest in the 1840s, at a moment in American history when the word West meant something almost incomprehensible to people living in Ohio or Missouri or Indiana. It meant unknown. It meant wild. It meant land that was available in enormous quantities to anyone willing to go and claim it. The United States government was actively encouraging settlement of the Pacific Northwest through something called the Oregon Donation Land Claim Act, which said that any white male citizen, and later any white man who declared his intention to become a citizen, could claim 320 acres of land in Oregon Territory just by going there, living on it, and farming it for 4 years. Married couples could claim 640 acres. That was almost a square mile of land free. In a time when land in the eastern states was expensive and getting more so, the promise of free land in Oregon was extraordinary. So people went. They went by the thousands. Between 1843, when the first large organized wagon train made the journey, and 1869, when the Transcontinental Railroad made the overland route largely obsolete, somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 people traveled the Oregon Trail. That number includes the families who kept going to California after 1848, when gold was discovered. It includes Mormon migrants heading to Utah. But the core of it, the tens of thousands who packed their lives into wagons and pointed them west toward the Willamette Valley, those are the people we're talking about tonight. And most of those people were families. Not single men looking for adventure, though there were some of those. Not professional explorers or soldiers. Families, parents and children, grandparents who were too old to be doing this, but came anyway. Young couples just starting out. Women who had never been more than 20 miles from the house they were born in, making a 2,000-mile journey with small children on their hips. Understanding that is what makes the whole story real. These were not extraordinary people by the standards of their time. They were ordinary people making an extraordinary decision, and then living with that decision, hour by hour, day by day, for 4 to 6 months, until they got to the other side of the continent. Or didn't. About 10% of them didn't make it. Disease took most of those. The trail was hard in ways that are easy to underestimate from a distance. But for the ones who made it, and most of them did make it, the journey was something that shaped them in ways they spent the rest of their lives trying to describe. So let's follow them. Let's start at the very beginning of the day. Before the sun, Section 1. Morning life and daily routines. The Oregon Trail ran roughly from Missouri, specifically from a town called Independence, all the way out to Oregon's Willamette Valley. The whole journey was about 2,000 miles, and most wagon trains made it in 4 to 6 months. That means they were traveling somewhere between 12 and 20 miles on a good day. And to get those miles in, they had to start early. When we say early, we mean early. A typical morning on the Oregon Trail started around 4 o'clock. For in the morning, not the romantic pre-dawn light you see in paintings, not the soft golden hour. 4 a.m. is dark. 4 a.m. is cold. 4 a.m. is the hour when every sensible person wants to be deeply asleep. And yet, there was a woman getting up. In most wagon train families, it was the wife or the oldest daughter, or sometimes both of them, who got up first, before the men, before the children, before anyone else had stirred. Hollywood, if it shows you this moment at all, tends to show a woman stepping gracefully out of a wagon, hair already somewhat nice, looking out at a dramatic sunrise with a sense of purpose and pioneer spirit. The real version was considerably less cinematic. She climbed out of a cramped wagon bed that she'd been sharing with anywhere from 2 to 8 other people, and whatever belongings hadn't been left out the night before. The wagon was about 4 feet wide and 10 feet long. That's about the size of a large bathroom. Now put a family in it, plus quilts, plus a trunk or two, plus maybe a spinning wheel or a rocking chair that someone couldn't bear to leave behind. That's where she slept. She climbed down in the dark, in clothes she'd probably slept in because it was cold and there was no reason not to, and she started looking for the fire. The fire from the night before might still have some embers, if she was lucky. If the night hadn't been too windy or too wet, she'd crouch down and blow on those embers and coax them back to life, feeding in small bits of dry grass or bark until she had something she could work with. This act, crouching in the dark and the cold, blowing carefully on a small spark, was as ordinary to her as making coffee is to us. She'd done it hundreds of times before the trail, at the hearth of whatever home she'd left behind. The difference was that here, if the wood was too wet or the wind was too high, there was no backup plan, no alternative source of heat, no other way to make the food that had to be ready before the wagon train moved. So she worked the fire with patience and with focus, the way you work at anything you genuinely need to succeed. And then she started breakfast. Now, here's where Hollywood really gets it wrong. If you've ever seen a wagon train scene in a movie, breakfast looks like a glorious spread. Maybe there's a whole side of bacon sizzling. Maybe there's fresh bread. Maybe there's coffee poured into real cups with a pleasant little steam curl coming off the top. Let me tell you what breakfast actually looked like on the Oregon Trail. Coffee. Yes, there was coffee, and it was genuinely one of the most important morale boosters on the trail. But it wasn't brewed in a nice pot. It was boiled in a tin or cast iron pot over an open fire, and it was strong and thick and sometimes gritty because the grounds didn't always settle all the way. But people loved it. They looked forward to it. It was hot, and it was bitter, and it was theirs. And in the middle of a cold prairie morning, that mattered a lot. The coffee was often green coffee beans that the woman roasted and ground herself. She'd pack the raw beans because they lasted far longer than pre-roasted or pre-ground coffee. Each morning, before she brewed, she'd take a small measure of those green beans and roast them in a dry pan over the fire, just a few minutes, until they darkened and fragrant, and then crush them with a rock or a small iron mortar and pestle. The smell of fresh roasted coffee on the open prairie, before the sun was fully up, was something trail travelers mentioned again and again in their diaries. It was familiar. It was warm. It was a piece of ordinary life carried intact across 2,000 miles of wilderness. Then there was cornmeal. Cornmeal showed up every single morning on most wagon trains. It was turned into a mush, basically a very thick, plain porridge, by stirring it into boiling water and letting it cook down. No salt, usually. No sugar, usually. Just cornmeal and water, cooked until it was thick enough to hold together. Some women were skilled at making the cornmeal mush more interesting with very limited means. A small amount of dried apple stirred in as it cooked, a spoonful of molasses if the supply hadn't run too low, a pinch of salt on days when they were not yet in the desert stretches where salt had to be conserved. These small variations were significant. They were the difference between a meal that felt like sustenance and a meal that felt like eating paste. Small things made big differences out there. On good days, there was bacon, or what passed for bacon, salt pork, really, which was a thick slab of pork preserved in heavy brine. It was salty and dense and not particularly pleasant to eat by modern standards. But it had fat and protein and calories, and those things mattered deeply when you were going to walk 10 miles before noon. The salt pork was usually sliced and fried in a pan. The fat that rendered out of it was saved, not wasted, never wasted, and used to grease the pan for the next meal or stirred into the cornmeal to give it some richness. Cooking fat was precious on the trail. Lard was in the supply list, but it got used up. Animal fat from the game that was occasionally hunted supplemented it. A woman on the trail learned quickly that nothing edible was thrown away. There was sometimes hardtack, a kind of very hard, very dry cracker made from just flour and water, baked until it was practically a rock. You soaked it in your coffee or your soup to soften it. If you didn't, you risked cracking a tooth. That's not an exaggeration. Hardtack had an interesting history by the time the Oregon Trail was in full swing. It had been a staple of sailors for centuries, for exactly the same reason it was useful on the trail. It lasted essentially forever if it stayed dry. The flour and water baked hard and expelled all moisture, and without moisture there was nothing for mold or bacteria to grow on. A piece of hardtack made in April could still be eaten in October. Not enjoyed exactly, but eaten. Some women improved on the basic hardtack recipe when time allowed and supplies held out. Adding a small amount of lard to the dough before baking made it slightly less like eating a piece of planed wood. Adding a scrape of butter on top when serving it made it feel almost like real food. These small improvements were the province of the woman who cooked, and the ones who were clever about it made a genuine difference to the morale of their families. And that was breakfast. For most families, most mornings, for most of the 4 to 6 months on the trail. Now, while the food was cooking, the woman was also, simultaneously, doing other things. Because the morning routine wasn't just about feeding people, it was about breaking camp. Every single morning, the wagon had to be packed back up. Whatever had been taken out the night before, bedding, cooking equipment, personal items, had to be repacked and secured before the wagon train started moving. This was partly practical. Stuff that wasn't tied down would get jostled loose on the rough trail and either fall out or get damaged. And partly, it was a matter of wagon train discipline. The train captain would call for departure at a specific time, and if your wagon wasn't ready, you held up everyone behind you. The wagon train captain was an elected position, chosen by the members of the party before they set out. His job was essentially logistics management, setting the daily departure time, choosing the route, making decisions about when to cross rivers and when to wait for better conditions, managing disputes between travelers, and generally keeping 100 or more people moving in the same direction at roughly the same pace. It was a genuinely difficult job, and the quality of the captain made a significant difference to the outcome of the journey. But that captain's authority was only as useful as the compliance of the people he led. And compliance started with every family being ready when it was time to move. So the woman packed. She folded and packed the blankets and quilts, folded them neatly, because you couldn't just stuff them in. They had to be packed in a way that kept them dry and that allowed the wagon to be loaded to its proper weight distribution. A wagon loaded wrong rode poorly and wore on the axles unevenly. She checked that the water barrels were filled. They'd usually filled them the night before if there was a water source nearby, but she needed to make sure the lids were on tight and that the contents hadn't been disturbed. She packed the cook pot and the tin cups and the plates. There weren't many. Back into the possum belly, which was a big leather pouch slung underneath the wagon that held the cooking equipment. She checked on the children, got them up, got them dressed, which on the trail meant making sure they had on enough layers and that their shoes were still intact, because shoes wore out fast on the rocky ground. Children's shoes, in particular, were a constant worry. The rough terrain of the trail was simply not compatible with footwear designed for life in a settled town. Soles came loose, leather split, stitching failed. A child walking on a damaged shoe could develop blisters and sores that, in an era before antibiotics, could become seriously dangerous if they got infected. A woman packing her wagon in the pre-dawn dark was running through a mental checklist that she knew by heart after the first 2 weeks. Water, food, bedding, children's shoes, tools, medicine, anything that had been left out overnight brought back in or secured to the outside of the wagon. She did this in the dark, by touch as much as by sight, because the fire was usually dying back down and the sun wasn't up yet. And she was doing all of this before sunrise. By the time the light started coming up, that first pale gray light that means morning is actually coming, she'd usually been up for about an hour. The food was ready. The wagon was mostly packed. The children were awake and complaining, probably. The fire was dying down, and the day hadn't even officially started yet. The wagon train typically began moving around 7 in the morning, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, depending on the terrain, the weather, and how the animals were feeling. The oxen or mules that pulled the wagons had to be yoked, attached to the wagon, which was the men's job, mostly. But while the men were doing that, the women were doing the final cleanup, scraping the pot, pouring out the coffee grounds, dousing the fire. Let's talk about the animals for a moment, because they were a central part of every morning in ways that most people today don't think about. The choice of draft animal was one of the most important decisions a family made before setting out on the trail. Oxen were the most common choice, and there were good reasons for this. Oxen were slower than horses or mules. They averaged about 2 miles an hour compared to 3 or 4 for a horse, but they were enormously stronger relative to their feed requirements. They could pull heavier loads on less food. They were calmer in difficult situations. And crucially, they could eat the prairie grass along the trail rather than requiring grain that had to be carried in the wagon. If an ox got injured or worn out near the end of the journey, it could also, if absolutely necessary, be eaten. You couldn't eat a horse, not practically, not in a cultural sense. A family might get too attached to a horse to use it for food, Oxen were kept at a more practical emotional distance. Mules were the choice of some parties, particularly those who were in a hurry or who needed to cross difficult terrain quickly. Mules were faster and more sure-footed in rocky mountains than oxen, but they required more skilled handling. They were more temperamental, and they needed better feed. Horses were used by some wealthier families or by mounted scouts and outriders, but rarely as draft animals. Yoking oxen, fitting the wooden yoke over their necks and attaching them to the wagon's tongue, was a two-person job and required the animals to be cooperative. Oxen that had done it many times before were calm about it. Oxen early in the journey, not yet accustomed to the routine, could be stubborn or frightened. A man struggling with an uncooperative ox in the pre-dawn, while his wife was finishing packing the wagon and the captain was calling for departure, was experiencing a kind of stress that was very common on the trail and very rarely mentioned in the romantic versions of the story. And then they walked. This is another thing Hollywood almost always gets wrong. In the movies, you see people riding in the covered wagon, bouncing along happily under the canvas, looking out at the scenery. In reality, most people walked, almost all day, every day. Here's why. The wagons were packed to the gills with supplies. There wasn't room to ride comfortably, and more importantly, the weight limit on the wagons was already being pushed. The oxen were working hard enough, just pulling the load. Adding the weight of a family riding on top was often more than the animals could handle, especially in rough terrain. So people walked. Women walked. Children walked. Even elderly people walked, as long as they were physically able. In the early part of the journey, people sometimes thought they'd ride more than they ended up riding. By the middle of the journey, walking 10 or 12 miles a day was just what you did. The walk itself was not a leisurely stroll. The trail surface varied enormously depending on where they were. In the early sections through Missouri and Kansas, the trail was often soft and sometimes muddy, which was exhausting in a different way than hard ground. Every step sank slightly, requiring more effort. As the trail moved west across the dry plains, it became dusty, and the passing of wagons ahead of you stirred up clouds of fine powder that coated everything: clothing, skin, teeth, eyes. The dust of the Oregon Trail was so fine and so pervasive that travelers wrote about it with something approaching trauma. You couldn't escape it. It was in everything. Later in the journey, through Wyoming and the Rocky Mountains, the trail became rocky. Sharp, hard rock under feet that had already walked hundreds of miles. The women wore leather shoes or boots, laced high against the ankle, and those shoes wore down quickly on that terrain. Heels wore through. Soles got thin. Leather cracked. By the later portions of the journey, many travelers had feet that were in significant pain, and they walked anyway. Now, walking 10 miles sounds like a lot, and it is, but spread out over a full day, over 8 or 9 hours of slow, steady movement at the pace of loaded oxen, it becomes less about athletic effort and more about endurance, about patience, about putting one foot in front of the other and then doing it again and again and again. The women were wearing long skirts, which dragged in the dust and got heavy when wet and tangled in brush. They were often carrying babies or small children who couldn't keep up with the pace. And they were walking alongside the wagon in case they were needed, to help push a stuck wheel, to hold a frightened animal, to keep children from straying too close to the wheels. It was not glamorous. It was not dramatic. It was one foot, then the other, all day long. And somewhere in the middle of all that walking, there was a child who needed attention, or a button that needed to be resewn, or a brief rest where a woman might pull out the mending she always carried with her, because there was always mending, and sit on a rock and fix a sock while the train rested the animals. Let's talk about the landscape that these women walked through, because it was one of the things that struck almost every traveler who made the journey, and because thinking about it now has a kind of vastness to it that's useful when you're trying to settle your mind. For the first several hundred miles, from Independence, Missouri, west across Kansas, the land was grassland. Not flat exactly, but rolling, gentle hills that went on, covered in grass that was often taller than a person's waist. In spring, which was when most wagon trains departed, this grass was green and new and full of wildflowers. Travelers from the eastern states, where you could rarely see more than a few hundred feet in any direction because of trees, found the open grassland almost overwhelming. The sky was simply enormous. It went all the way from the ground on one side to the ground on the other side, and there was nothing interrupting it. Some people found this beautiful. Some people found it disorienting, even frightening. There was a psychological phenomenon called prairie fever that some settlers experienced, a kind of anxious melancholy brought on by the sheer scale of the open landscape. After days and weeks of nothing but grass and sky and the same slow pace, some people became profoundly unsettled. Their diaries described a feeling of being erased, of being too small in too large a space. Others felt the opposite. They felt freed. They felt like they'd spent their whole lives in rooms that were too small, and here at last was room to breathe. The women who did best on the trail were generally the ones who could find something to anchor themselves in the daily routine. The fire, the meal, the mending, the children's bedtime. These small repetitive acts were a kind of tether, not just practical necessities, but psychological ones. I have done this before. I know how to do this. This I can manage. The midday break, sometimes called the nooning, was usually about an hour. The animals rested and grazed. People ate a cold meal because there wasn't time to start a fire. That meal was usually something they'd saved from breakfast, or hardtack, or dried fruit if they had it. The nooning was a brief but genuine rest. People sat in whatever shade was available, usually the shade of the wagon itself, since trees were scarce on the plains. Some slept for a few minutes. Some tended to small tasks. Some simply sat and were still, looking out at the land, giving their feet a rest. And then the walk started again. By the time the wagon train stopped for the night, usually late afternoon, around 4 or 5 o'clock, the animals were tired, the people were tired, and the day's work was only about half done. Because now the evening camp had to be set up. The fire had to be started. Supper had to be cooked. The animals needed water. And she started again. There's something quietly remarkable about that rhythm. Not the heroism of it, not the hardship, which was real, but the steadiness, the repetition, the same tasks, done every single day, without ceremony, without applause, without anyone writing it down. Just the fire, just the pot, just the folding of blankets in the dark before sunrise. Day after day, mile after mile, one quiet morning at a time. Section 2. Work and job. Now let's talk about the work. Not the walking, not the cooking, the other work. The work that happened in the cracks of everything else. The work that never really stopped. Because here's the thing about pioneer women on the Oregon Trail. And this is something that gets almost completely lost in the popular version of the story. They didn't just travel to Oregon. They ran households while traveling to Oregon. Think about that for a second. Right now, if you wanted to pick up your life and move it 2,000 miles, you'd have about 100 support systems helping you. Moving trucks, rest stops, grocery stores, hotels, laundromats, gas stations, urgent care centers, pharmacies. The list goes on. In 1850, none of those things existed along the trail. Everything your family needed to survive, food, clothing, medicine, clean water, basic medical care, you carried with you, or you produced yourself, or you went without. And the person who managed most of that was the woman. Let's start with laundry. I know, laundry sounds like the least interesting possible topic, but I promise you, laundry on the Oregon Trail is actually fascinating in a very quiet, meditative kind of way. You couldn't just toss things in a machine. You couldn't even toss things in a wash tub very often, because water was sometimes scarce, and when water was available, you couldn't always stop long enough to do a full wash. So laundry happened whenever conditions allowed. When the wagon train stopped near a river or a creek with enough water, when there was enough time to actually do it, when the weather wasn't making everything worse. When laundry day did come, it was a significant event. Women would carry the dirty clothes down to the water source. They'd heat water in a pot over a fire. They had a bar of hard lye soap, homemade, usually from fat and ash, and a washboard, which was a corrugated metal board you pressed and rubbed the clothing against to get the dirt out. And they scrubbed. Let me tell you something about what laundry actually looked like on the trail, so you can really picture it. The clothes being washed had been worn every day for a week or more. They'd been walked in, worked in, slept in. They were carrying the dust of the prairie and the smoke of the campfire and the smell of wood and animals and hard physical labor. Getting that out required real effort. The washboard was held upright in the water, usually propped against the inside of the wash tub or against a rock in the river. The clothing was wetted and soaped, and then worked against that corrugated surface in a scrubbing motion, pushing and pulling with the whole upper body. You had to press hard enough to actually move the dirt out of the fabric, and the effort was in your arms, your shoulders, your back. A woman washing the clothes of a family of 6 or 7 was doing this for hours. She might be standing in the river or kneeling at the bank. The water was often cold. Rivers fed by snow melt in the Rockies stayed cold well into summer. Her hands were submerged in that cold water for hours. Lye soap was harsh and dried out skin that was already cracked from wind and sun. Then everything had to be rinsed, then wrung out by hand, twisted and squeezed until as much water as possible was removed, which required significant hand strength, then hung to dry, usually on bushes or on the wagon itself, or on a line stretched between two wagons. And the whole time, you're hoping it doesn't rain. The average wagon train woman did laundry maybe once a week if conditions allowed, sometimes less often, which means that for the days in between, everyone was wearing the same clothes, working in them, walking in them, sleeping in them, sometimes. There was no shame in this. Everyone was in the same situation, but it meant that clothing took a tremendous beating. There's a logistical reality to trail laundry that the history books rarely describe, but the diaries do. When you have only 2 or 3 changes of clothing per person, which was typical because weight was a severe constraint, and you're walking through dust and working through heat and sleeping rough, those garments are not just getting dirty. They're deteriorating. The fibers are weakening. The seams are pulling. The cotton or wool is being abraded by constant movement and by the harsh soap and the scrubbing. A dress that started the journey looking new would, by the end of 4 months on the trail, look significantly older, faded by the sun, softened from washing, repaired in places where it had begun to fail. The clothing itself became a record of the journey, which brings us to mending. Mending was constant. It was the background hum of a woman's evenings on the trail. Every spare moment, sitting by the fire after supper, riding in the wagon during a rare rest, waiting during the nooning, was potentially a mending moment. She carried a small sewing kit, needles, thread, scissors, extra buttons. These were treated as genuinely precious items. You kept them dry. You kept track of them. The needles on the trail were made of steel, which could rust if they got wet and weren't dried properly. A rusted needle became a broken needle. You'd push it through fabric and it would snap. So needles were treated with care, stored in a small tin or wrapped in a scrap of wool that held them dry and prevented rust. Thread was wound carefully and kept from tangling, because detangling thread with cold, chapped hands in poor light was a miserable task. Scissors were sharp. A woman who let her scissors go dull would find herself struggling with every cut, and struggling with simple tools wastes time and patience. Because when your child's shoe sole came loose, you sewed it back on. When the knee of a pair of trousers wore through, and it wore through quickly, you patched it. When the canvas on the wagon started to fray or tear, you repaired it. When a harness strap broke, you might be the one who knew how to fix it. If you didn't, things fell apart. And things falling apart on the Oregon Trail wasn't just inconvenient. It could be dangerous. A shoe that failed could mean a child unable to walk on rocky ground. A harness strap that broke might mean a loose animal, or worse, a runaway wagon. A torn canvas cover on the wagon meant everything inside could get wet, and wet flour was ruined flour, and ruined flour meant less food, and less food meant real trouble. The mending happened at all hours, but it concentrated in the evenings, around the campfire, when the day's walking was done and the supper was finished and the light was just barely good enough to thread a needle. Women bent over their work. In the firelight, holding the cloth close to their faces to see the stitches. Their eyes got tired. Their backs ached from leaning. They kept going. There's a particular kind of focus that comes with hand sewing by firelight. It's not comfortable exactly, but it has a quality of absorption, a narrowing of attention down to the small, precise world of the needle and the thread and the cloth that can be almost meditative when you let it be. The hands know what to do. The mind can be somewhere else or nowhere at all, following the repetitive motion of the stitch. Women on the trail talked and sang and listened to the conversation around them while they mended. They didn't have to stop everything else to do it. Their hands worked, and the rest of them was present in the evening's life of the camp. Here's a surprisingly modern thing about all this work. Women on the Oregon Trail complained about it in their diaries, and a remarkable number of women kept diaries, which is how we know so much about this. They wrote about being tired, about wishing they could have a day off, about the monotony of the same tasks over and over. One woman, a traveler named Amelia Stewart Knight, kept a diary of her 1853 journey to Oregon, and it's one of the most vivid records we have. And she writes about the weariness with a kind of matter-of-fact honesty that feels completely modern. She describes days when her feet hurt so badly she could barely walk. Days when the weather was so bad she couldn't get a fire started. Days when the children were sick and there was nothing she could do about it except keep going. She wasn't dramatic about it. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was just writing it down. She also wrote about good days. Days when the weather was beautiful and the road was smooth, and she walked well, and the children were good, and the supper came together nicely, and everyone slept well. She wrote about those with equal matter-of-factness, not gushing, not overblown. Just, this was a good day. Reading her diary, and the diaries of other women who made the journey, you get a very clear picture of a person who had a realistic sense of what her life was. Not romanticized, not dramatized, just honestly reported day by day with all its frustrations and satisfactions. There was also medical work. This falls under the category of things Hollywood tends to leave out entirely, not because it's violent or dramatic, but because it's just ordinary care. The kind of care that women have been providing to their families for as long as families have existed. Women on the trail were the primary medical practitioners for their families. There were no doctors on most wagon trains. There were occasionally people with some medical training, a man who'd read a medical book, a woman who'd learned from her mother. But for most families, the wife was the closest thing to a doctor that existed. She knew which herbs could reduce a fever. She knew how to set a simple fracture with a splint and cloth strips. She knew how to treat a bad blister before it became infected. She knew the symptoms of cholera, which was the great killer of the Oregon Trail. By the way, not attacks or wild animals, but cholera, a waterborne illness that could kill a person in hours. And she knew the protocols for trying to keep it from spreading. Let's talk about that for a moment, because the medical reality of the Oregon Trail is one of the most significant parts of the story and one of the parts that's most often glossed over. Cholera was caused by contaminated water. Specifically, it was caused by a bacteria, Vibrio cholerae, that infected the human digestive system and caused violent, rapid dehydration through diarrhea. People who got cholera could go from healthy to dead in a matter of 12 to 24 hours. In 1850, nobody knew about bacteria. Nobody understood germ theory. That would come in the 1860s and 1870s. They knew that cholera spread somehow through water and that it killed quickly, but the mechanism was invisible to them. The trail followed rivers, and those rivers were the water source for hundreds of wagon trains over the course of each season. When a party upstream suffered from cholera, and the disease contaminated the river, the parties downstream didn't know. They drank the water, and they got sick. Women who understood, or who had learned from hard experience, or from careful reading of the medical guides that were available, boiled their water before drinking it. Boiling killed the bacteria, even though they didn't know why it worked. They just knew it helped. They also used vinegar, which was acidic enough to inhibit bacterial growth, to treat water or to clean cooking implements. When someone in the party got cholera, the woman of that family was the nurse. She kept them as comfortable as possible. She tried to get liquids into them, which was difficult when the disease was expelling fluids faster than they could be replaced. She managed the other children and kept them away from the sick person. She cleaned and disposed of contaminated materials as carefully as she knew how. She also managed her own fear. Because cholera moved through wagon trains like fire, and everyone who saw it knew that the person sick today might be dead tomorrow, and the person nursing them today might be sick themselves by next week. She managed that fear by continuing to work. There was always something to do. The fire needed tending. The other children needed feeding. The wagon needed to be ready to move again when the patient recovered, or, in the worst cases, after they were buried at the side of the trail and the wagon train had to keep going. Graves along the Oregon Trail were common. Modern archaeological surveys have identified more than 2,000 of them, and historians estimate the real number was likely many times higher. Most were simple: a mound of earth, a wooden marker if they had wood, a stone cairn if they didn't. The wagon train often moved on the same day. The women who did this, who buried their children or their husbands or their siblings, and then got up and made breakfast and yoked the oxen and kept going, were not extraordinary. They were ordinary people doing what ordinary people in that situation were required to do. Keep going. Because stopping was not an option. Because the season was running out and the mountain passes ahead would close with snow in October, and they had to be through before that happened. She managed all of this while also cooking and mending and walking and breaking camp and setting up camp and doing it again the next day. And here's another thing that hardly ever makes it into the story: childcare. The average American woman in 1850 had somewhere between 5 and 7 children. On a wagon train, those children were with her all day, every day. There was no school to drop them off at, no playground around the corner. They were there, underfoot, needing to be fed and watched, and kept from wandering too close to the wagon wheels or falling into the river. Small children couldn't walk the whole distance, so they rode in the wagon or were carried. Older children could walk and were expected to help, fetching water, gathering wood for the fire, watching younger siblings. But the overall management of the children, their health, their morale, their safety, their education when possible, fell to the mother. The question of children in danger on the trail is worth sitting with for a moment, because it was a constant, low-level anxiety for every parent on the journey. Wagon wheels were the most common source of accidental death for children on the trail. The wheels of a loaded wagon moving at even a slow walking pace are heavy and relentless. A child who slipped and fell near a moving wheel had essentially no chance if the driver didn't notice immediately. And drivers were often distracted, managing the team, watching the road ahead, dealing with any number of other concerns. Children were repeatedly, sternly instructed to stay away from the wheels. Some listened. Children don't always listen. River crossings were the other major danger. Rivers had to be crossed, and the crossings could be treacherous. The depth and current varied. The bottom was uneven. Wagons could tip. Animals could panic. Children who went into fast water could be swept away before anyone could reach them. A mother managing a crossing with 3 or 4 children, making sure everyone stayed in the wagon, making sure the younger ones were held, watching the water level around the wheels, was managing genuine mortal risk with a calm exterior because there was no other choice. Panic would not help. Steady attention would. Some women were pregnant during the journey. Some gave birth on the trail. Birth in a wagon, or in a tent, or under the open sky, attended by other women in the party who had experience with childbirth. This happened many times over the history of the trail. The babies born on the Oregon Trail were sometimes named for the circumstances of their birth. There are records of children named for rivers they were born near, or for the month they arrived, or simply given names that marked them as trail children. Some women on the trail taught their children lessons during the nooning, sitting in the shade of the wagon with a book they'd brought from home. Not many books. Weight was a serious issue on the trail, and a lot of beloved books got left behind when wagons had to be lightened. But some women managed to bring a Bible, or a reader, or an almanac, and those books did double duty as both education and entertainment. The teaching itself was informal. It wasn't a classroom. It was a mother, tired from a morning of walking, sitting on the wagon tongue with a child beside her, pointing to words in a book and asking the child to read them, doing simple sums in the dust with a stick, telling the child the names of the plants they'd seen that morning and whether they were edible. This informal, embedded education was how most American children in 1850 learned. Formal schooling was available in settled communities, but it was not universal, and it certainly wasn't available on the trail. What was available was a parent who knew things and took the time to pass them on. Let's talk about one more job: water. Water management on the Oregon Trail was a constant, critical task. You needed water to drink, to cook, to water the animals, to do any cleaning at all. And water sources varied wildly along the trail, from plentiful rivers in the early portion of the journey to stretches of the route through the high desert where there might be no water at all for a day or more. Before reaching a dry stretch, women helped fill every water container the family had: barrels, jugs, any vessel that could hold water. She kept track of how much was left. She rationed it carefully, knowing that if they ran out before the next water source, they were in serious trouble. The desert stretches of the trail, particularly the section through the Black Rock Desert in what's now northwestern Nevada, sometimes called the 40-mile desert, were among the most feared portions of the journey. 40 miles of sand and alkali flats with no water source. Travelers had to cross it in a single push, usually traveling through the night to avoid the worst of the heat, filling every container they had at the Humboldt sink before they started and praying it was enough. Animals suffered on the desert crossing. The alkaline dust was caustic to their hooves and nostrils. The heat and lack of water weakened them. Dead oxen alongside the trail were so common in this stretch that travelers barely remarked on them anymore. The woman walking through that desert, or riding in the wagon if there was space and the animals weren't already overloaded, was watching the water carefully, calculating this much water left, this many miles to go, this many people and animals to supply. The arithmetic of survival is a particular kind of thinking. It doesn't leave room for despair. You just do the numbers and act accordingly. This wasn't dramatic. She wasn't hauling water while dramatic music played. She was just keeping track, keeping mental count, managing the numbers. It's the kind of work that doesn't make a good movie because it's invisible until it fails. Nobody writes a scene where the heroine successfully keeps everyone hydrated through the desert crossing. But when it went wrong, when a family ran out of water, when a child got severely dehydrated, that failure was catastrophic. The women who did this work, well, didn't get celebrated for it. It was just expected. It was just what you did. You kept track of the water. You made the food. You kept the children alive. You mended the shirt and packed the wagon and got up tomorrow and did it all again. Day after day after day. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a movie. It was just work. Quiet, steady, essential work. And those women did it. Every single day. Section 3. Food and eating. Let's talk about food. This is one of my favorite parts of this whole story, because food on the Oregon Trail is such a perfect example of the gap between what we imagine and what actually was. If you've ever watched a Western movie with a trail scene, you've probably seen campfire cooking that looks pretty appealing. A big pot of something savory, maybe a Dutch oven full of stew, 10 cups of hot coffee, maybe somebody slapping a nice piece of meat on a fire. And some of that was real, kind of, but the full picture is a lot more interesting and a lot more repetitive than any movie ever shows you. Let's start with what a family would have packed. When a family got ready to make the Oregon journey, they consulted guides, actual printed guidebooks that gave advice on what to bring. The most commonly recommended packing list included things like flour, a lot of it, usually about 200 pounds per adult, cornmeal, dried beans, bacon, the salt pork we talked about earlier, coffee, sugar, rice, dried fruit if you could afford it, vinegar, which people back then understood was useful for preventing certain kinds of illness, though they didn't know why, lard for cooking fat, salt, baking powder. That's it. That's the foundation. Let me give you a sense of the quantity involved. For a family of 5 making a 6-month journey, the recommended supplies included roughly 800 pounds of flour, for 100 pounds of bacon, 100 pounds of coffee, 200 pounds of sugar, 100 pounds of dried beans, 75 pounds of dried fruit, and 50 pounds of rice. That's well over 1,000 pounds of food, not counting cooking equipment, water barrels, bedding, tools, clothing, and everything else the wagon had to carry. That weight was the reason wagons were so heavy. That weight was the reason oxen were so essential. They could pull it, where mules could not always manage. And that weight was why every ounce mattered, why nothing could be wasted, and why any additional food gathered along the trail, through hunting, foraging, or trade with Native American groups, was so valuable. There were no fresh vegetables, no fresh meat, except what you might hunt or trade for along the way. No eggs, except occasionally from chickens some families brought along in crates under the wagon, though most of those chickens didn't survive very long. No milk, except from the milk cow that some families drove alongside the wagon. When they had a milk cow, it was a genuine luxury. Fresh milk, sometimes enough to churn a little butter if they had a churn. A lot of families didn't have a milk cow. The daily eating rhythm went something like this. Breakfast, as we talked about, was cornmeal mush and salt pork and coffee. Noon was a cold meal, leftover cornmeal mush that had hardened into a kind of dense cake, or hardtack, or dried fruit and crackers if they had them. No fire at noon, no time. And supper was the main event. Supper was cooked over the evening campfire, and it was typically the most elaborate meal of the day, which still wasn't very elaborate, but it was warm and it was cooked fresh, and after a day of walking that counted for a lot. The most common supper dish was beans, specifically dried beans that had been soaking in water all day while they traveled, in a covered pot hanging from the wagon. By evening, they were soft enough to cook into a thick, simple bean soup with salt pork or bacon for flavor. Add some cornbread baked in a Dutch oven buried in the coals, and you had something that was genuinely satisfying after a hard day. Let's talk about those beans for a moment, because they deserve more credit than they usually get. Dried beans were one of the great survival foods of the 19th century. They were shelf-stable for years if kept dry. They were compact and relatively light for the nutrition they provided. They were inexpensive. They contained protein and complex carbohydrates and fiber, and a diet that included beans regularly was substantially better than a diet that didn't. People on the trail who ran low on their other provisions could survive for a surprisingly long time on beans and cornmeal alone. The preparation was simple but required planning. Each morning, a measured amount of dried beans was put into a pot of water and left to soak as the wagon moved. The soaking softened them and shortened their cooking time. By evening, they were plump and ready. Into the pot went water and a piece of salt pork, cut small, to spread the flavor further, and sometimes a dried onion if they had one, and the whole thing went over the fire. Beans cooked slowly. The supper fire had to be started early enough for the beans to be properly tender before the family was too hungry to wait. A woman who misjudged the timing or who had trouble getting the fire going might end up serving beans that were still slightly hard in the center. Not dangerous, but unpleasant to eat after a long day. Getting the timing right was a skill, and experienced trail cooks had it down. Dutch oven cooking, by the way, is one of those areas where pioneer women were genuinely skilled in ways we don't always appreciate. A Dutch oven is a heavy cast iron pot with a lid. You can bury it in hot coals, pile more coals on top of the lid, and use it as a kind of primitive oven. It takes real knowledge to judge the temperature, how many coals, how long, how to tell when your cornbread is done, and women who got good at it could produce remarkably consistent results. The Dutch oven was one of the most important pieces of equipment on the wagon. Cast iron was heavy. A standard Dutch oven might weigh 8 to 12 pounds empty, but it was essentially indestructible and could do things that no other trail cooking equipment could do. Bread, biscuits, cakes on special occasions, pies if there were berries or dried fruit to fill them, roasted meat. Baked beans. Properly used, a Dutch oven could turn limited ingredients into something that felt like a real meal. Improperly used, it could burn everything, waste precious fuel, and produce something inedible. The difference was knowledge, practice, and attention. A well-made Dutch oven cornbread, eaten hot by firelight at the end of a 20-mile walk, was probably one of the more genuinely pleasurable experiences of the journey. Think about that. Hot cornbread from a Dutch oven, eaten when you are genuinely, deeply hungry from a full day of physical work in the open air. The smell of it as the lid comes off, the steam, the slightly crisp bottom crust from the coals, the dense, grainy interior that fills you up. That is not a hardship food. That is a good food, eaten in the right circumstances. Occasionally, there was fresh meat. When the wagon train passed through hunting territory, particularly the Great Plains, where bison herds still numbered in the millions in the mid-1800s, hunters in the party might bring back fresh meat. Buffalo, usually. Sometimes antelope. Occasionally rabbit or prairie chicken. Fresh meat was treated as a celebration. It was something different. Something that wasn't salt pork or beans or cornmeal. Women cooked it carefully, often making a proper stew that used some of the precious dried vegetables or herbs they'd packed, stretching the fresh meat as far as it would go. The bison of the Great Plains were one of the great natural spectacles of 19th century America, and the women on the trail witnessed them at the height of their abundance. Herds that stretched from horizon to horizon. Animals that stood 6 feet at the shoulder and weighed a ton, moving in masses so large that they shook the ground when they ran. Travelers wrote about hearing a herd before they could see it, a low rumble that grew until the earth itself seemed to vibrate. The bison gave the trail travelers meat and also useful materials. The dried dung of bison, called buffalo chips, was one of the primary fuel sources on the treeless plains where firewood was scarce. It burned slowly and produced a hot, even fire. Gathering buffalo chips was often a children's job, and trail diaries frequently mention children coming back to camp with aprons full of chips, which everyone used without any particular squeamishness because the alternative was no fire. If there was more meat than could be eaten in a day, it was preserved, cut into thin strips, and hung on the sides of the wagon to dry in the sun and wind, making a kind of jerky. Waste was not an option. Now, here's one of those surprising, weirdly modern facts I promised you. Pioneer women were deeply concerned about nutritional balance. Not in a modern, scientific way. They didn't know about vitamins or minerals or micronutrients. But through generations of accumulated folk knowledge, they understood that people who ate nothing but meat got sick. People who ate nothing but bread got sick. People needed variety, and they did their best to create it even in limited circumstances. This folk knowledge was specific and practical. It had been developed over generations of farming life where winter isolation and limited food variety were regular realities. Women knew, from their grandmothers and from their own experience, that teeth and gums that went soft and bleeding were a sign that something was wrong with the diet. That legs that ached and joints that were swollen might mean the same thing. that a person who was eating but still weakening needed something their food wasn't providing. They were observing scurvy without having a word for it, and their practical solution, get some fruit or fresh vegetables into the diet as often as possible, was exactly correct. This is why dried fruit was taken seriously as a trail supply. A small handful of dried apple slices or dried peaches added to the cornmeal mush in the morning wasn't just a treat, it was prevention. Women who had the knowledge understood, in a practical way, that those dried fruits were keeping scurvy at bay, even if they couldn't have told you what scurvy was caused by. Foraging was another strategy. When the wagon train passed through areas with wild edibles, wild onions, berries, certain greens, women collected them. Not everyone had the knowledge to forage safely, but those who did treated it as a real skill, and wild greens gathered along the trail ended up in the evening supper pot more often than the history books acknowledge. Wild onions grew along much of the early trail through Missouri and Kansas. Service berries and chokecherries ripened along river banks in summer. Watercress grew in cold streams. Wild currants could be found in the mountain meadows. All of these were gathered and used by women who had enough botanical knowledge to distinguish the edible from the poisonous. The women who had this knowledge were valuable to their whole party, not just their own family. On a wagon train where 20 or 30 families were all dealing with the same dietary limitations, a woman who knew which plants were safe to eat was a community resource. Let's talk about the actual physical act of cooking over an open fire for a minute, because it's another one of those things that sounds romantic and is actually just kind of relentlessly difficult. You don't have a stove. You don't have an oven with a temperature dial. You have a fire, and the fire does what fires do. It burns hotter and cooler and flares up and dies down based on the wind and the wood and the moisture content of everything involved. Learning to cook on an open fire consistently is a real skill. Getting the heat right, knowing which pots to use for which purpose, managing several things cooking at different rates at the same time. Fire making itself was a skill that women had to be completely competent at, because the woman who started the cooking fire was usually starting it alone in conditions that weren't always cooperative. On the plains, the wind was often strong enough to make fire starting difficult. You had to build a windbreak of stones or logs before you could light your fire. You had to lay the fuel correctly, dry grass or moss as tinder, small sticks as kindling, larger fuel on top, and get it lit with a flint and steel or with the phosphorus matches that were becoming more available by the 1850s. Phosphorus matches, sometimes called lucifer matches or friction matches, were relatively new technology in the 1840s and 1850s. They were not reliably available everywhere, and they were fragile. A wet box of matches was a ruined box of matches. Women who had them kept them wrapped in oilskin or in a waterproof tin. They also usually kept a flint and steel as a backup, because a flint and steel worked in wet weather in ways that wet matches did not. And all of this cooking was happening in any weather. It's raining? You're still cooking supper. The wind is blowing so hard it keeps putting the fire out. You're still cooking supper. You've walked 12 miles and your feet hurt, and the children are cranky, and there's a thunderstorm building to the west. Supper still gets cooked. There's something meditative about that, actually. Not the hardship of it. I don't want to romanticize the difficulty, but the commitment to the task. The way that cooking supper wasn't something you did when conditions were perfect. It was just something you did, regardless. Every evening, the same routine, the same small rituals, the same smells. Coffee brewing, beans simmering, the specific sound of cornbread batter in a Dutch oven. Day after day, those smells were the signal that the walking was done for today, that the camp was set, that something warm was coming, that the family was going to eat and then rest. Those smells meant safety. They meant arrival, even if it was only for one night. Let's think about what the eating itself was like, because the physical act of eating on the trail had its own particular quality. There were no tables most of the time. You ate sitting on the ground, or on a log or a rock, or leaning against a wagon wheel. The tin plate was balanced on your knee or held in your hand. The tin cup of coffee or water was set carefully on flat ground beside you because there was nowhere else to put it. Everything was eaten with a spoon or with fingers. Fork usage was less universal than we might imagine. Many trail families had one or two forks, shared among the children, while the adults managed with spoon and bread. Wiping bread across the plate to get the last of the bean broth was not bad manners on the trail. It was efficiency. The sounds of the evening meal were simple. The soft knock of tin cups being set down. The scrape of a spoon against the bottom of the pot. The sound of people eating when they are genuinely hungry, which is, actually, a fairly quiet sound, because when you are really hungry, you tend to focus on the food. After eating, there was always the question of what to do with the utensils and pots. Washing up on the trail was minimal. The Dutch oven was scraped clean with a stick or a piece of hardtack. The tin plates were wiped with a rag. The tin cups were rinsed if water was available and set to dry. This wasn't laziness. It was the understanding that soap and water were scarce resources that had to be preserved for more urgent needs. The beans, the fire, the coffee, simple things, the same things, night after night, across 2,000 miles. There's something very quiet about that. Something that fills up a tired person, not just with food, but with something harder to name. Just the smell of supper cooking. Just the fire. Section 4. Homes and shelter. Now let's talk about where they actually slept. Because this is another area where the movie version has created some very persistent myths. The covered wagon, the iconic image, the thing you see in every illustration, the symbol of the whole westward movement, was not a comfortable home. It was a vehicle. It was a moving truck. It was four wheels and a wooden box and a canvas cover, and it was designed to transport your belongings from Missouri to Oregon, not to provide a pleasant living experience. Let's describe one, slowly, so you can really picture it. The wagon box, the wooden platform and sides, was typically about 4 feet wide and 10 to 12 feet long. The canvas cover arched over the top, supported by wooden or metal bows, and came to an open end at both the front and the back. The canvas was usually treated with linseed oil to make it somewhat water resistant. Somewhat. When it rained hard, things still got wet. The wagon was built for utility. The wood was seasoned hardwood, oak or ash or hickory, chosen for its strength and resistance to splitting. The wheels were the most complex part. Wooden spokes fitted into a wooden hub, all held in place with iron tires, iron bands that wrapped the outside of the wheel and kept the whole thing from falling apart. The axles were iron-capped wood. The wagon tongue that connected to the yoke of the oxen was a single long piece of sturdy timber. Every part of this vehicle had been designed over generations of wagon building to be both strong and reparable. If a wheel broke, you had to be able to fix it at the side of the road with the tools you'd brought and whatever materials were available. If an axle cracked, you needed to be able to replace it or splice it. The guidebooks that families consulted before leaving listed the spare parts a wagon should carry: extra wheel spokes, extra axle wood, iron bolts and rings, rawhide for binding repairs, tar for waterproofing, and for lubricating the axles. The squeal of an undergreased axle was one of the characteristic sounds of the wagon train. It started as a faint complaint and grew louder if ignored, until the friction became serious enough to damage the wood. Every few days, wagons had to be stopped and the axles re-greased, packed with a mixture of tar and animal tallow that reduced friction and kept the iron from rusting. This was another job that fell to whoever was available, and women did it along with everything else. Inside the wagon, every available inch was packed with supplies: the flour barrels, the cornmeal sacks, the tool chest, which held axes and shovels and spare parts for the wagon, the medicine chest, a small wooden box with glass vials of things like laudanum, castor oil, quinine for fever, and camphor, the family's clothing, packed into trunks, the bedding, quilts and blankets and pillows. And in among all of this, the family slept. At night, the sleeping arrangements depended on the weather and the family's preference. When the weather was good, men often slept under the wagon or in tents alongside it, small, simple canvas tents that could be staked out quickly. Women and children usually slept in the wagon itself, in a space that had been partially cleared for the purpose. If you were lucky, you'd arrange the trunks and barrels in such a way that a reasonably flat sleeping surface existed. You'd spread your quilts over it. You'd settle in. The process of making the wagon ready for sleeping was its own small ritual. The children were settled first. The youngest ones were laid down with their blankets and didn't need much persuading. They were usually asleep before anyone else. Older children were arranged around whatever space was available, their small bodies tucked in among the familiar shapes of the family's belongings. Then the woman settled herself into the space that remained. Sometimes that was a The temperature inside the wagon at night ranged from genuinely cold to suffocatingly hot, depending on the season and the climate. Early in the journey, crossing Missouri and Kansas in the spring, nights could still be cold enough to need several blankets. By July, crossing the high desert of what's now Nevada, nights could drop sharply even after blazingly hot days. Some nights on the trail were simply miserable in terms of temperature. There wasn't much to be done about it except pile on more blankets or kick them off. Off. The sounds inside the wagon at night were interesting. The canvas made noise in the wind, a kind of soft, rhythmic rustling. If the animals were nearby, you could sometimes hear the oxen shifting their weight, breathing heavily. If the camp was on flat ground, there was often just the quiet of the prairie, which is actually a specific kind of quiet. Not silence exactly, more like a vast, soft hum, wind in the grass, the occasional call of a nighthawk, insects. If you were near a river, and wagon trains often camped near water, you had the sound of moving water, constant, low, very calming. Not everyone traveled in covered wagons, and not everyone lived in the wagon the whole journey. A significant portion of Oregon Trail travelers were not wealthy enough to own a proper wagon outfit. Some traveled with just a pack animal or two, carrying what they could on their backs or in saddlebags. Some joined parties as hired help in exchange for passage. Some were walking with essentially nothing except the clothes on their backs. For these travelers, shelter at night was whatever could be arranged. A tent, if they had one. A lean-to of branches and canvas. In good weather, just their bedroll under the open sky. Sleeping under the open sky on the Great Plains on a clear night, with the Milky Way spread out above you, accounts from the time describe it with a kind of awe. The sky out there, far from any city, far from any light source, is enormous. It is absolutely full of stars. People who had grown up in eastern cities and towns had never seen a sky like that. Some women wrote about it in their diaries. One traveler, a woman named Helen Carpenter, described lying on her back and watching the stars and feeling, and this is her word, small. Not in a frightening way, in a humbling way, in a way that put the day's exhaustion in perspective. There you are. You've walked 10 miles. Your feet hurt. Your back aches. The food was boring and the children were difficult, and a wagon wheel cracked and had to be repaired, and the day was too hot. And then the night comes, and the stars come out, and the prairie is quiet, and everything gets very, very still. Now let's talk about what happened when families reached Oregon and actually built permanent homes. Because the journey itself was only the first chapter. When a family arrived in the Willamette Valley, or wherever they'd claimed land in the Oregon Territory, they had to build a house. And those houses, at first, were almost always just one room. One room for the whole family. Before the house was built, the family lived in the wagon. This could go on for weeks or months while the land was being cleared and the timber was being felled and prepared. The wagon that had carried them 2,000 miles continued to serve as home while the permanent one was being constructed. In that one room, a fireplace, which served for both cooking and heating, a table, a couple of benches or chairs, beds, either wooden frames with rope webbing to support a straw mattress, or sleeping platforms built into the walls. Whatever personal items had survived the journey. And that was essentially it. Building that one-room house was a community effort, usually. Neighbors, other settlers who had arrived earlier or at the same time, came together for a log raising, a day when the whole community assembled and worked together to put up the walls. This was a tradition brought from the eastern frontier, where no family could build alone. The logs were heavy and had to be fitted precisely at the corners, and the work went faster and safer with many hands. The women at a log raising fed the workers. They cooked in quantity, more than their usual daily cooking, using whatever was available, and served it to the men who were doing the heavy lifting. It was division of labor that made sense given the physical realities, but it meant that on a day when the whole community was gathered, the women were working as hard as anyone. After the walls were up and the roof was on, usually a roof of bark or split shingles, weighted with poles or heavy stones to keep the wind from lifting it, the family moved in. The interior was raw, log walls with the bark still on, or stripped down to bare wood. A dirt floor, the fireplace that was the center of everything. The walls were logs, notched at the corners and stacked, with the gaps filled with a mixture of clay and dried grass called chinking. The floor was usually just dirt, packed hard from constant use, sometimes swept clean every morning because a dirt floor can actually be kept surprisingly tidy. A few years in, if the family was doing well, they might be able to add a plank floor, a genuine luxury. The woman of the house made that floor as clean and firm as she could. She swept it daily with a broom made of bound twigs or dried grass. She wetted it down occasionally, which packed the surface harder. She put down whatever rush mats or rag rugs she had, made from materials saved from the journey. The floor was not elegant, but it was hers, and she maintained it with the same steady attention she'd given to everything else. The windows, if there were windows, were small, both to preserve heat and because glass was expensive and hard to transport to the frontier. Some had real glass panes. Many had just wooden shutters or oiled paper stretched over a frame, which let in some light, but not a proper view. In winter, and winters in the Willamette Valley were mild by the standards of the Ohio and Missouri winters most settlers had left behind, but they were still wet and gray and cold. The family spent most of their time in that one room, cooking, working, the children doing whatever lessons the mother could arrange. The evenings, the interior of such a house was dim. In the daytime, the fire gave light. At night, candles, which the woman of the house made herself by dipping wicks into melted tallow, gave a soft, yellow, flickering glow. Candle making was one of those tasks that happened in batches because it was time consuming and messy and worth doing enough at once to last for a while. The tallow, beef or mutton fat, rendered and clarified, was melted in a large pot. A series of wicks made of twisted cotton thread were suspended from a rod. The wick was dipped into the tallow, withdrawn, allowed to harden slightly, then dipped again. Layer by layer, dip by dip, the candle grew to usable size. It took many dips to make a single candle. Making enough candles to light the house through the winter was a half-day's work at minimum. That light, by the way, was nothing like modern electric light. Candle light is soft and warm and reaches only so far. The corners of the room were in shadow. The ceiling was in shadow. Everywhere beyond the immediate circle of the fire and the candles was a kind of comfortable dark. People's eyes adjusted. They did their evening tasks by that light, the mending, the spinning, the reading aloud if there was a book. And when the tasks were done, the candles were blown out and the fire was banked down, kept burning at a low, slow rate so it wouldn't have to be completely restarted in the morning, and the family settled into a darkness that was total. No street lights, no screens, no glow from anything. Just the soft orange pulse of the banked fire, and the sound of the wind outside, and the darkness. It was the kind of darkness that wraps around you like another blanket. Heavy, still, complete. That darkness is something that almost no one in the modern world experiences anymore. In our world, there is always some light. The glow of a street light through a curtain, the small red eye of an electronic device, the ambient light of a city bouncing off low clouds. True darkness, the kind that existed everywhere before electricity, is now rare. But that darkness in a pioneer cabin in Oregon in the winter of 1850 was complete. You held your hand in front of your face and couldn't see it. The children were shapes you could only locate by sound, their breathing, their small movements. And in that darkness, the body let go in a way that it couldn't when light was still visible. The darkness said, "The day is over. Everything that is going to happen today has happened. You are done." And so you slept. For Section 5. Entertainment and evening life underscore. All right, let's talk about what people actually did for fun, because this might be the biggest surprise of the whole story. If you've gotten this far in our evening together, you've heard a lot about work, about the cooking and the mending and the laundry and the walking. And you might be starting to wonder, did anyone ever relax? Did anyone ever just enjoy themselves? The answer is yes. Genuinely, actually, yes. Not in a modern way. Not with streaming services and social media and 100 options for entertainment, but in a different way, a quieter way that I think is actually kind of beautiful. Let's start with music. Music on the Oregon Trail was real and frequent and genuinely beloved. A lot of families brought instruments with them. The most common was the fiddle, a violin, essentially small and portable and resilient. Fiddles got packed in wagons and played around campfires and danced to on Sunday afternoons when the wagon train rested. A good fiddle player in a wagon train party was treated like a genuine community resource. They played after supper. They played while people sat around the fire and let the day's tension loosen. They played dance music, reels and jigs and square dance tunes, when people had energy for it. Think about what it would have meant to be the fiddle player in a party of 30 wagons. Every evening, after the work was done, you had something that nobody else had: the ability to change the mood of an entire camp in a few notes. A slow, sad tune could quiet a restless group. A fast reel could get tired legs moving again. The fiddle player's instrument was wrapped carefully, protected from rain and dust, treated almost as carefully as the family's food supply, because once it was damaged, there was no replacing it out there. And people did have energy for it, even after walking all day. There's something about music, about rhythm, about moving together that generates its own energy. Women who'd spent 12 hours walking and cooking and minding children would still get up and dance at a campfire if the fiddle started playing. The dancing itself was simple. There wasn't a dance floor, obviously, just flattened grass or packed dirt near the fire. Couples and groups would form for square dances or simple reels, the kind of dancing that didn't require much space and that everyone, regardless of formal training, could join. Children danced too, copying the adults, laughing when they got the steps wrong. There was something about dancing under an open sky, with firelight flickering and the prairie dark and enormous all around, that travelers described with real fondness in their diaries. It was one of the few times during the day when the body moved for joy instead of necessity. All day, the legs walked because they had to. In the evening, for a few minutes, they moved because it felt good. Some families brought other instruments too: harmonicas, banjos, occasionally a small parlor organ or a melodeon, though those were on the heavier side and sometimes got left behind when wagons needed to be lightened. Voices, of course, were always available. Singing was common: hymns in the evenings, folk songs, children's songs, whatever people knew. The harmonica had a particular advantage on the trail. It was small, cheap, durable, and easy to learn at a basic level. A man or woman who could play even simple tunes on a harmonica could provide entertainment for an entire evening with an instrument that fit in a coat pocket. Banjos were less common but deeply loved where they existed. The banjo had come into wider popular use in America through minstrel show music in the 1840s, and it carried a particular sound that travelers associated with home and with festivity. And here's the funny part: if you could go back in time and listen to the music around those campfires, you'd recognize a lot of it. Songs like "Oh Susanna," which was written in 1847 and became immediately popular on the trail. "Home Sweet Home," "My Old Kentucky Home," hymns that are still sung in churches today. The songs that pioneer women hummed while they cooked supper were not so different, at their bones, from what their great great grandchildren still listen to. Music is one of those threads that runs straight through history without breaking. Reading was another significant source of entertainment and mental nourishment for those who were literate, and on the Oregon Trail, more people were literate than you might expect. Literacy rates in America in the mid 1800s were actually reasonably high, particularly among the kinds of families who were undertaking the Oregon journey, who tended to be from the settled, educated Eastern and Midwestern states. Books were heavy and space was precious, but people still brought them. The Bible was almost universal, not just for religious reasons, but because it was a long, rich, complex text that could be read and reread and interpreted and discussed essentially forever. Many trail diaries mention Bible readings in the evening, sometimes communal readings where a passage was shared and discussed around the fire. A family's Bible was often more than a religious text. It was frequently the place where important family records were kept: births, deaths, marriages, written in the front or back pages in careful handwriting. A Bible carried across the Oregon Trail often arrived in the Willamette Valley with new entries added during the journey itself. A birth recorded somewhere on the Platte River, a death recorded near South Pass. These books became, in a very real sense, portable family archives. Beyond the Bible, people brought whatever they cherished most. Novels. Charles Dickens was hugely popular in America by the 1850s. Poetry, history books, agricultural guides, almanacs. Almanacs in particular deserve a mention because they were genuinely useful documents on the trail, not just entertainment. An almanac contained weather predictions, planting guides, astronomical information about the phases of the moon and the positions of stars, and often a great deal of practical household advice. A family that carried an almanac had a reference work that helped them plan, even far from any other source of organized information. The reading itself, when it happened, was often communal. One person, often the most confident reader in the family, which was sometimes the mother, sometimes an older child, would read aloud while others listened, mending or whittling or simply resting as they listened. This kind of shared reading was a normal form of entertainment in 19th century America generally, on the trail or off it, because books were expensive and reading aloud let everyone enjoy a single copy together. And of course, people talked. This sounds obvious, but in an era before electronic entertainment, conversation was a primary leisure activity. Not small talk, real conversation about the journey, about plans, about the land they'd left behind and the land they were heading toward, about religion, about politics, about farming and children and the nature of the weather. On the trail, people from different backgrounds were thrown together in proximity for months at a time. A farmer from Ohio ended up camping next to a German immigrant family, next to a former schoolteacher from New England, next to a young couple from Kentucky. In the evenings, these people talked to each other. They shared food and shared stories and formed friendships that sometimes lasted the rest of their lives. These friendships were significant because the families who arrived together in Oregon often settled near each other, recreating in the new territory something like the community they'd had on the trail. Wagon train friendships could determine, in a very practical sense, who your neighbors would be for the rest of your life. People chose their traveling companions carefully when they could, and the bonds formed over months of shared hardship and shared evenings were often lasting ones. Gossip was also very much a thing. I want to be honest about this because it's a genuinely human and amusing part of the story. Wagon train communities were small, usually between 20 and 40 wagons, maybe 100 to 200 people, and they were in very close proximity for months. People knew each other's business. People talked about each other. Who was arguing with whom? Whose children were the most difficult? Whether the train captain was making good decisions? Who had packed too much and was slowing down the wagon because of it? Whether the young woman in the third wagon was being courted by the young man from the fifth. 170 years later, this feels exactly like social media. There's something comforting, actually, in recognizing that the impulse to know what's going on with the people around you and to talk about it is not a modern invention or a flaw of any particular generation. It's just a deeply human thing. People have always wanted to know the story of the people near them. They've always enjoyed telling each other what they've noticed. Courtships happened on the trail, too, and they were watched with great interest by everyone in the party. A young man and a young woman walking together during the day, or sitting near each other after supper, was the subject of considerable speculation. Marriages sometimes happened along the way, conducted by whatever clergyman or authority figure was available, or postponed until arrival in Oregon. The shared experience of the trail, the same hardships, the same small joys, created bonds between young people that, in some recorded cases, lasted for the rest of their lives. Sunday was the traditional rest day for most wagon trains, though not all. Many parties tried to observe the Sabbath by not traveling, or at least traveling less. This gave people a rare chance to do maintenance tasks, proper laundry, wagon repairs, letter writing, and also to simply rest. The Sunday rest, when it happened, had a different quality from the rest of the week. Without the urgency of needing to cover miles, the pace of the whole camp slowed. Women who normally rushed through their morning routine to be ready for departure could take their time. Breakfast might be slightly more elaborate if ingredients allowed. There was time for a proper church service if the party included someone willing to lead one, usually an informal gathering, with hymns sung and a passage read, and perhaps a short sermon, conducted in the open air with the whole camp in attendance. Letter writing was taken seriously because whenever the wagon train passed a post office or met an eastbound traveler or mail carrier, it was an opportunity to send letters home. Women wrote long, detailed letters to their mothers and sisters and friends back in Ohio or Indiana or wherever they'd come from. These letters are another of the great historical sources for understanding trail life, written in plain, honest language, describing exactly what the days were like. Writing a letter on the trail required real effort. Paper was limited and had to be conserved. Ink, if liquid ink was carried, could spill or dry out. Some travelers used pencils instead, which were more practical for rough conditions. A woman writing a letter home was often doing it by firelight, balancing the paper on a book or a flat piece of wood, trying to keep her handwriting legible despite tired hands and poor light. These letters served an emotional purpose beyond their practical content. Writing home was a way of staying connected to a life and a family that might be thousands of miles away and that the writer might never see again. Many women on the trail were leaving parents, siblings, lifelong friends, with the understanding that they would likely never return east. The letter was sometimes the last connection to that old life, and women poured real feeling into them. Even within the constraints of 19th century epistolary convention, which tended toward understatement and modesty about hardship. Children's entertainment was mostly what it's always been: running, yelling, chasing each other, making up games with whatever materials were available: rocks, sticks, wildflowers, a hoop and stick. Pioneer children were remarkably good at entertaining themselves because they had no other option, and most trail diaries that mention children also mention their resilience and adaptability. Children on the trail invented their own forms of play suited to their circumstances. They raced each other across open ground. They played simple games with stones, arranging them in patterns or using them in games similar to jacks or marbles. They collected things: pretty rocks, interesting feathers, wildflowers, the way children collect things everywhere and always have. Older children sometimes organized younger ones into games of pretend, acting out stories from books they'd heard read aloud, or simply playing house with whatever materials were at hand. By the end of the journey, a child who'd started out in Missouri had walked nearly 2,000 miles, crossed three major rivers, climbed mountain passes, endured weeks of heat and cold and rain, and arrived in Oregon tougher and more capable than most adults of our current era will ever be. In the evenings, after supper, after the music, after the conversation started to wind down, people simply sat by the fire, quietly. There's a word for what they were doing, actually. It doesn't translate perfectly, but the Germans have a word, Gemütlichkeit, that captures something of it. The warmth and comfort of being together in a quiet place. The ease of sitting with people you trust, without needing to be anywhere else or do anything else. Just sitting, the fire getting lower, the conversation getting quieter. One by one, people drifting towards sleep. Section 6. The night routine. Let's follow the evening all the way down to sleep. Supper is done. The Dutch oven has been scraped clean and set aside. The coffee pot is empty. The fire has been fed one last time, and it's burning steady and low. Not a roaring fire, just a gentle one. Enough to sit near, enough to see by. The children are getting sleepy. This is the part that the trail diaries almost always mention in one way or another. The way children, who had run and played and complained all day, went quiet in the evenings. The way the walk and the fresh air did what no bedtime routine could manufacture. They simply got tired. Their eyes got heavy. They leaned against their mothers. A mother would lift a sleeping child and settle them into the wagon, or they'd already climbed in themselves, already curled up in the blankets while the adults still sat by the fire. Either way, the children went down early on the trail. By 8 or 9 o'clock, most of them were asleep, and the adults sat a little longer. There was always a little more to do. A last check of the animals, making sure the oxen were settled, making sure the horses were tethered. A last look at the sky, because the sky told you what tomorrow was going to be. A quick scan around the camp to make sure everything that needed to be undercover was undercover. Let's slow down on that last check of the animals for a moment, because it was a small but important ritual. The oxen, after a full day of pulling the wagon, were unyoked in the evening and allowed to graze and rest. They were usually picketed, tethered with a long rope to a stake driven into the ground, or hobbled in some other way that allowed them to graze without wandering off. Losing your draft animals on the trail was a genuine catastrophe. A wagon without oxen was a wagon that wasn't going anywhere, and the family's entire journey depended on those animals staying healthy and staying close. So in the deepening evening, someone, sometimes the man of the family, sometimes the woman, sometimes both together, walked out to check on the tethered animals, made sure the rope hadn't tangled, made sure the animals seemed comfortable, not limping, not showing signs of illness. This was a brief task, but it was one more thing that had to happen before the day could truly be called finished. And then she banked the fire. Banking a fire means managing it down to a low, slow burn that will last through the night without going out. You push the larger logs together toward the center, bury the embers in the ash a little, close it down. If you do it right, in the morning there are still live coals under the ash, and you can coax the fire back up without starting from scratch. Women who traveled the trail were very good at banking fires. It was a skill like all the other skills. There was a particular technique to it. You wanted enough fuel left to smolder slowly through the cool night hours, but not so much that it might flare up unexpectedly. You arranged the remaining wood carefully, often in a particular pattern that experienced fire tenders learned through trial and error, with the largest, densest pieces positioned to burn slowest. Then ash was pulled over the top, insulating the coals from the cooling night air, trapping just enough heat to keep them alive until morning. A woman who banked her fire well saved herself real effort the next day. Instead of building a fire from nothing in the cold pre-dawn dark, she could simply uncover the coals, blow gently, and have a working fire again within minutes. This small act of foresight, repeated every single night for months, was one of the quiet skills that made the difference between an efficient camp and a struggling one. The night air on the Great Plains. Let's be there for a moment. It's cool. Even in summer, the nights out there are noticeably cooler than the days. The temperature drops as the sun goes down, and the heat that the flat, wide land collected all day begins to radiate back up into the sky. There's a smell to it. Dry grass, sage, if they've come far enough west. The particular dusty smell of the wagon canvas. The lingering smoke of the fire. And underneath all of that, the clean, wide smell of open space. The smell of land that goes on for a very long time in all directions. The sky gets darker and fuller as the fire dies down. Stars appear, not one or two, all of them, every single one of them, from horizon to horizon, in a sky with no competition, no other light to wash them out. The Milky Way is a river of pale light overhead. The Big Dipper hangs in the north, right where it should be. Planets are bright enough to cast faint shadows. People in 1850 navigated by those stars. They knew them. They looked up at them every night and felt located. There's the North Star. There's where I am. There's where I'm going. This kind of celestial knowledge was not specialized or rare. It was ordinary knowledge, the way knowing how to read a clock face is ordinary knowledge to us now. Children learn the constellations from their parents the way they learned anything else, through repetition, through pointing fingers, through the casual transmission of useful information during quiet evening moments. A child on the Oregon Trail likely knew the North Star and several major constellations by the time they were 6 or 7 years old, simply because that knowledge was woven into ordinary family life. She climbs into the wagon. She lifts the canvas at the back. There's a flap that ties shut, and she settles herself into the narrow space. Around her, the familiar shapes. The flour barrel. The wooden trunk with the brass fittings. The smaller shapes of her sleeping children. She pulls the quilts over herself. The quilt she's sleeping under was probably made by her own hands, or by her mother's hands. Quilts on the frontier were not just bedding. They were made from scraps of fabric that carried their own histories. A piece of a dress that wore out. A fragment of a shirt that belonged to someone who was gone. Old cloth, carefully saved, stitched into something new and useful and warm. Quilt making itself deserves a moment of attention because it was one of the great domestic arts of the 19th century, and it was practiced with real skill by women across the country. A quilt was made of 3 layers, a decorative top, sewn together from many smaller pieces of fabric in a chosen pattern, a layer of cotton or wool batting in the middle for warmth, and a plain backing fabric. The 3 layers were then quilted together, stitched through all the layers and patterns that held everything in place and added structural strength. A full quilt could take many weeks or months to complete, even working only in spare evening hours. Women often worked on quilts collaboratively, especially before a major life event like a wedding or, in this case, before setting off on a major journey. A woman heading west might carry a quilt made partly by her own hands and partly by her mother's, her sisters, her friends, a physical object that held the memory of the women who had stitched it, even as she carried it thousands of miles away from them. She pulls it over herself. The wagon settles. Outside, the prairie makes its sounds. The wind through the grass. The low, rhythmic song of insects that are different here than they were back home. Somewhere far off, a coyote. The coyote is not dangerous. It sounds eerie if you're not used to it. That high, wavering call. But anyone who'd spent a few weeks on the trail knew that coyotes minded their own business. The sound became familiar. The sound became part of the night, the way rain on a roof becomes part of the night. She's tired. She's always tired by this point in the evening. Bone tired, the way you get when you've been using your body all day for real work. Not the kind of tired that comes from stress or screens. The kind that comes from walking and lifting and bending and stirring and carrying. That kind of tired is actually a very peaceful kind of tired. Your body knows it worked. Your muscles have the warm, loose feeling of genuine exhaustion. Your joints have settled. Your feet, which ached all afternoon, are finally still. She breathes. In, out. The canvas over her head moves very slightly in the breeze. Just a little. Just enough to see. Tomorrow will be the same as today. She knows this. She's made her peace with it. Wake before dawn. The fire. The cornmeal. The walking. But tomorrow is tomorrow. Tonight there is just this. The quilt. The dark. The sound of the wind. The small sounds of her children breathing. The far-off coyote, quieting now. The stars overhead. Outside the canvas, going on forever. She closes her eyes. The fire has gone down to almost nothing. Just a soft glow at the center of the ash. Just warmth. The prairie is very still. She's not thinking about tomorrow. She's not worrying about the water supply or the condition of the trail ahead or whether the youngest child's cough might be getting worse. Right now, she's just here. Warm. Still. The wagon holds her. The quilt holds her. The dark holds her. One more breath. And sleep. Stay here for a while. In this quiet. On the prairie. In the dark. The wagon trains that crossed the Great Plains in the 1840s and 1850s. There were thousands of them. Thousands of families. Thousands of women who did exactly what we've been talking about tonight. They woke before dawn. They made the fire. They cooked the cornmeal. They walked, day after day after day. And on each of those days, when the evening came, they did what we just described. They banked the fire. They climbed into the wagon. They pulled the quilt over themselves. And they slept. Right now, lying where you are, in your warm bed, in your quiet room, you are doing something those women would have recognized completely. You are resting. You, you are still. The day is done. Let's think about the wagon for a moment. Just the wagon. In the dark. It's sitting on the flat ground of the prairie, the way wagons did. The wheels are still. The canvas is still. The whole thing is resting after a day of motion. Wagons made sounds when they were moving. The creak of the wooden boards. the groan of the wheel axles, the particular sound of iron wheel rims on different kinds of ground, the dry rattle over stone, the soft muffled sound over grass, the suck and release of mud. But at night, the wagon was silent, just sitting, resting, the way everything rests at night. The oxen nearby, their breathing slow and even. Big animals breathe slowly. If you've ever been near a large animal at rest, you know the sound. A deep, regular, unhurried rhythm. In, out, in, out. The other wagons in the circle, most trains arrange their wagons in a rough circle at night, were also silent by now. The fires had all died down. The people had all gone to sleep. The circle formation itself is worth understanding because it served a practical purpose beyond simple organization. Arranging the wagons in a rough circle, or sometimes an oval, depending on the terrain, created a kind of enclosed space at the center where the animals that needed extra protection could be kept, and where the camp's daily activities could happen with some shelter from the wind. The gaps between wagons could be closed with chains or ropes if there was any concern about animals wandering off in the night, or, though this was far rarer than the movies suggest, any concern about safety. The wagons themselves, once arranged for the night, became a small, temporary village. 100 or more people, sleeping in a rough circle on the open prairie, each family in their own wagon or tent, but all of them part of the same slow-moving community, heading the same direction, sharing the same exhaustion and the same quiet hope. Just the quiet. Let's think about what that quiet was like. Far from any city, far from any town, in the middle of the American continent, which in 1850 was mostly grassland. Miles and miles of grass. The grass moved in the wind, constantly, the way water moves. A slow, rolling motion. From a high point, a prairie in wind looks like the surface of the sea. At night you couldn't see that motion, but you could hear it. A low, constant, soft rushing sound. The sound of 1,000 acres of grass in a breeze. That sound would fill the whole night. Steady, constant, like breathing. The women who slept on the Oregon Trail heard that sound every night for months. It became as familiar as silence. It became the sound of night itself. Some of them, when they arrived in Oregon and finally slept in a real house with real walls, said they missed it. The sound of the prairie at night. The sound of all that open space breathing around them. It's a sound that asks nothing of you. It just goes on, steady and soft and very, very patient. The grass, the wind, the dark. Think about the stars again. Out there on the prairie, the stars were remarkable. They still are, in places that haven't been filled with light. But in 1850, everywhere on the trail was dark like that. Imagine them now. Not the few dozen stars you might see from a city. All of them. The whole sky full. The Milky Way, the wide, faint band of light that is actually the edge-on view of our own galaxy, stretched from one horizon to the other. Those women knew those stars. They'd grown up with them. But out on the open prairie, without trees or hills or buildings to interrupt the view, the sky was bigger than anywhere they'd been before. Big enough to feel small in a good way, in the way that puts things in proportion. Your problems are real. Your tiredness is real. Your aching feet are very real. And the sky goes on forever, Both things are true at the same time. There's something calming about that. Not dismissive, not a way of saying your problems don't matter, just a way of letting them be their proper size. Small, under a very large sky. Manageable, in the morning. But for right now, the sky. Just the sky. Think about the river crossings. Not the danger of them, just the sound. Rivers were everywhere on the early part of the Oregon Trail. The Platte River, the North Platte, the Sweetwater. When the wagon train camped near a river, which they often did, because water was the priority, the river was the sound of the night. Moving water has a very specific sound. It varies based on the speed and the shallowness and the rocks. A fast, shallow river over rocks makes a bright, chattering sound. A slow, deep river makes a lower, more continuous rumble. The Platte River, which wagon trains followed for weeks, was wide and shallow. A famous description of it at the time noted that it ran a mile wide and barely an inch deep in places. It was full of sandbars. It ran quick and braided across the flatland. At night, camped near the Platte, the sound would have been that wide, soft rush. Not loud, not dramatic, just present, continuous. The way rain on a roof is continuous. That sound, too, became part of the sleep. People who live near rivers often find it very difficult to sleep without that sound when they move away. The body gets accustomed to it. The mind uses it as an anchor. Something moving in the dark outside, constant and steady while you are still. It tells you the world is doing what it does. The river is running. Everything is as it should be. You can rest. Let's talk a little more about the rivers themselves, because they shaped so much of the daily rhythm of the trail, and because the actual experience of crossing them was one of the more demanding parts of the journey, even though it usually happened without major incident. A river crossing began long before the wagons actually entered the water. The train captain, or sometimes a small group of experienced men, would scout the crossing point ahead of time, looking for the shallowest, most solid-bottom stretch, checking the current speed, looking for any underwater obstacles. Some crossings were simple fords, where the water was shallow enough that the wagons could simply drive across, the oxen pulling steadily through water that might come up to their knees or, at deeper points, their bellies. Other crossings were far more involved. At wider, deeper rivers, wagons sometimes had to be partially unloaded to reduce weight, or floated across using the wagon box itself as a makeshift boat, with the wheels removed and the box caulked to be more watertight. Ropes were sometimes strung across the river so that swimmers or floating wagons had something to hold on to against the current. Livestock that couldn't be loaded into wagons were driven across separately, swimming, with riders managing the herd to keep them moving in the right direction and to prevent them from being swept downstream. For the women in this process, a river crossing meant a day of heightened vigilance. Children had to be kept close, often held directly rather than allowed to walk, because the footing near a riverbank could be unpredictable and the current, even in a seemingly calm stretch, could be stronger than it looked. Belongings that might be damaged by water, the flour, the bedding, anything not already protected, needed extra securing before the crossing began. Once the crossing was successfully completed, There was a particular kind of relief that settled over the camp. A genuine obstacle had been passed, another piece of the journey behind them. The relief often expressed itself in small celebratory ways. A slightly better supper if anyone had energy to prepare one, a bit more music in the evening, a sense of having earned the rest that was coming. The women who kept diaries on the trail wrote about the rivers. They wrote about how beautiful they were. The clarity of the mountain streams later in the journey, where the water came straight off snowfields and ran cold and clean over pale rocks. They wrote about washing their faces in those streams in the morning, the shock of the cold water, the feeling of being clean, briefly, before the dust of the trail covered everything again. There's a woman named Keturah Belknap who kept a detailed record of her 1847 journey. She wrote about a spot along the trail where the wagon train stopped near a clear, cold creek in a meadow full of wildflowers. She wrote that she walked to the edge of the creek and just stood there for a while, looking at the water, listening to it. She didn't explain why. She didn't need to. We know exactly why. Because sometimes you just need to stand next to something clear and cold and moving. And breathe. There were wildflowers along the trail. In the early portions of the journey, in April and May, through Missouri and Kansas, the prairie was full of spring wildflowers. Buttercups, wild roses, prairie phlox, which is a small pale pink flower that grows in dense clusters. Children gathered them. Women pressed them between the pages of their journals or diaries, the way people have always pressed flowers into books. Some of those pressed flowers still exist in archives and historical collections, in old journals that have been carefully preserved. You can find these wildflowers from the Oregon Trail, flat and brown and fragile now, 170 years later. But once they were pink, once they grew in a meadow on the Kansas prairie in the spring of 1850, and a woman stopped and picked one and thought, I want to keep this. That impulse to hold on to something beautiful is so human. To notice the wildflower, to stop just for a moment and keep it. Let's think for a while about the specific flowers that grew along different parts of the trail, because each region had its own character, its own particular beauty, and the women who walked through them noticed. In the early Kansas prairie, beyond the phlox and the buttercups, there were also wild indigo, with its tall spikes of pale flowers, and prairie coneflowers, with their drooping yellow petals around a dark central cone. There was blue-eyed grass, despite its name not actually a grass at all, but a small relative of the iris, with delicate blue-violet blooms that opened only in full sun and closed again by afternoon. Further west, as the trail moved into drier country, the flowers changed. Less of the lush, moisture-loving prairie blooms, more of the hardy, drought-resistant plants suited to harsher ground. Indian paintbrush, with its brilliant orange-red bracts, grew in patches along dry hillsides. Lupin, with its tall purple-blue spikes, covered entire slopes in some seasons, turning hillsides the color of a late evening sky. In the high country near South Pass, the wildflower season was compressed into a short window, since snow lingered late and came again early. But when the flowers did bloom, they bloomed intensely. Alpine forget-me-nots, tiny and impossibly blue, growing low against the rocky ground. Columbine, in pale yellow and soft pink, nodding on slender stems in the mountain meadows. Women who'd grown up in the eastern states, accustomed to garden flowers and cultivated beds, found something different and moving in these wild blooms that grew without anyone's tending, in places no one had planted them, surviving conditions that would have killed many garden flowers outright. There was a lesson in that, for some of them, about resilience and about beauty that doesn't require comfort to exist. Let's think about the mornings again. Very gently. Not the work of them, not the early rising, just the light. The light on the prairie before the sun is fully up is a particular shade of blue, not the warm light you see in paintings. A pale, clear, almost silver blue. The grass is darker than it will be during the day. The air is still. The light comes slowly from the east, changing gradually, too gradually for you to catch the exact moment it shifts from dark to light. One moment it is night, and then slowly it is morning. There is no sharp line between them, just a gradual softening of the dark, the stars beginning to fade at the edges of the sky. Birds beginning, not many at once. One, somewhere in the grass. Then another, farther away. Then slowly more, the way a conversation starts, quietly, with just a few voices, and then filling out. The larks were a constant presence on the prairie. Western meadowlarks, specifically, a bird with a loud, rich, complex song that sounds almost like it's too beautiful for a bird. A liquid, musical phrase that rises and falls. Wagon train diaries mention them often. People notice them. People love them. The sound of a meadowlark at dawn on the Great Plains is the sound of a continent waking up. Clear and bright and unhurried, carrying a long way in the still air. Let's spend a little more time with that early morning sound, because it has a quality worth lingering on. The meadowlark's song typically comes in short, distinct phrases separated by pauses, not a constant stream of sound, but something more measured, more deliberate. Each phrase rises slightly, holds, and then resolves downward, the way a sentence might end with a gentle falling tone. Other birds joined in as the light grew. Horned larks, smaller and less showy than the meadowlarks but numerous on the open plains, added their thin, high calls. Killdeer, near any water source, gave their sharp, repeated cry, the sound that gave them their common name. Hawks, riding the first thermals of the warming morning air, sometimes circled silently overhead, visible against the brightening sky before anyone below had even fully woken. For a woman already up and tending the fire in that pre-dawn hour, this slow chorus of birdsong was simply the backdrop to her work. She likely didn't stop to specifically listen to it most mornings. She had cornmeal to stir and a wagon to pack. But it was there every morning, this quiet layer of sound underneath everything else she was doing. And on the mornings when she did pause, when the light was especially beautiful, when the air was especially still, the bird song was there waiting for her attention, as it always had been. Let's think about the mountain passes. Late in the journey, after weeks on the plains, the wagon trains reached the Rocky Mountains. Specifically, they came to South Pass, which is a broad, gradual crossing through the Continental Divide in what's now Wyoming. Unlike the dramatic mountain passes you might imagine, narrow, steep, clinging to cliff edges, South Pass is actually quite gentle. The mountains are far to the north and south. The pass itself is a wide, open saddle of high land, and the crossing is so gradual that people often didn't realize they'd gone over the Continental Divide until they were already on the other side. This gentleness was actually one of the most important geographic facts in the entire history of westward American expansion. If South Pass had been a narrow, steep mountain crossing like so many others in the Rockies, wagon travel west might never have been practical at the scale it eventually reached. The relatively gradual slope and wide opening of the pass meant that heavily loaded wagons, pulled by tired oxen, could make the crossing without needing to be disassembled or hauled by hand over impossible terrain. Travelers often described a particular feeling at the actual crest of the pass, a sense of psychological as much as geographic significance. This was the point where the rivers stopped flowing east, toward the Mississippi and the Gulf of Mexico and the country they'd left, and started flowing west, toward the Pacific and the country they were heading toward. Some families paused here, even if only for a few minutes, aware that they had crossed an invisible but real line. Behind them was everything they'd known. Ahead was everything they didn't yet know. The nights at altitude are different. Colder, much colder, even in summer. Women piled on every blanket they had. The air is thinner at elevation. Breathing is easier than it sounds. People adjusted, but there's a quality to high-altitude air that's hard to describe except as clean. Genuinely, purely clean. The sky at altitude is darker. More stars. Somehow, though the stars haven't changed. Just the air between you and them is less. Thinner. Clearer. The stars seem closer. Close enough, on a very clear night, to feel like something you could almost reach. Women lying in their wagons at South Pass, in the cold nights of July, wrapped in quilts, looking up through the gap in the canvas at the top of the wagon, watching the stars, waiting for sleep. There's a particular quality to sleep at altitude and in the open air that people have always commented on. It's heavier, more complete. The body, which has worked hard all day in thin air, is grateful for rest in a very direct, physical way. Sleep that comes from genuine tiredness is one of the best things in the world. Not the restless sleep of someone who hasn't moved enough. Not the troubled sleep of someone full of caffeine or stress. The sleep of someone whose body has been useful, whose legs have carried them through country they'd never seen before, whose hands have cooked and mended and lifted and carried. That sleep comes quickly. It comes deeply. It doesn't ask for anything. It just holds you. Beyond South Pass, the trail continued through country that kept changing character. There was a stretch near what travelers called the Sweetwater River, a smaller, clearer tributary that the trail followed for a portion of the climb toward the pass. The Sweetwater earned its name, travelers said, because compared to the alkaline, otherwise open plain, was one of the most significant. Travelers who reached it by the 4th of July were considered to be making good time, since arriving there later risked running into snow in the mountains ahead before winter. Many travelers carved or painted their names into the rock's surface, leaving a record of their passage that, remarkably, much of which still survives today. A woman walking past Independence Rock, footsore and tired after weeks on the trail, might have very gently. After South Pass, after the Rockies, the wagon trains descended toward the Snake River and eventually toward the Columbia River country. After South Pass, after the Rockies, the wagon trains descended toward the Snake River and eventually toward the Columbia River country. The landscape changed. The prairie gave way to sagebrush desert, flat, dry, fragrant. Sage is one of the most evocative smells in the American West. It's sharp and herbal and deeply clean. When it rains on sage, or when the morning dew settles on it, the smell intensifies. It fills the air for miles. Women on the trail wrote about the smell of sage. It was different from anything they'd known at home. Strange at first, then familiar, then beloved. This stretch of the trail, through what's now southern Idaho, was demanding in a quieter, less dramatic way than the river crossings or the mountain passes. There was no single dangerous obstacle to overcome, no famous landmark to mark progress. Just mile after mile of sagebrush plain, the Snake River often visible but maddeningly difficult to reach because of the steep canyon walls that, in places, separated the trail from the water by hundreds of feet. Travelers wrote with real frustration about hearing the Snake River, even seeing it glinting far below, while being unable to get their animals or themselves down to drink from it. The geography of that stretch created a particular kind of thirst-driven anxiety that compounded the more general weariness of having already traveled well over 1,000 miles. But even in this difficult stretch, there were small mercies. Hot springs along parts of the route offered a strange luxury. Naturally heated water where exhausted travelers could, if they chose, soak tired muscles for a few minutes before continuing on. Some of the larger tributary streams that did reach the main trail provided welcome breaks in the otherwise relentless sage country, with cottonwood trees offering shade that had been entirely absent on the open plains. By the time they reached Idaho, most families had been traveling for 3 to 4 months. The wagons themselves showed the wear of the journey, canvas patched in multiple places, wheels that had been repaired more than once, axles that creaked despite regular greasing. The people showed wear too, clothing patched and repatched, faces browned and weathered by sun and wind, bodies leaner than they'd been at the start, from the combination of hard physical work and a diet that, while sufficient, was far from generous. And yet, alongside the wear, there was also a kind of hardening that had happened, not in a negative sense, but in the sense of genuine capability. A woman who had managed 3 months of trail life had learned things about herself and about endurance that she likely hadn't known before she started. She had banked 1,000 fires. She had walked 1,000 miles. She had nursed the sick and buried the dead, and kept her remaining children fed and clothed and as safe as circumstances allowed. She knew, by this point in the journey, that she could do hard things. That knowledge didn't make the remaining miles easier in any physical sense, but it gave her something to draw on, a kind of confidence that comes only from having already proven something to yourself through actual experience, rather than simply believing it might be true. Women on the trail wrote about the smell of sage. It was different from anything they'd known at home. Strange at first, then familiar, then beloved. By the time they reached Oregon, the smell of sage meant they were nearly there. Nearly. Underscore. The Oregon Territory in 1850 was green, not the dry, golden green of summer grass. Green like a forest, like moss, like rain. After months in the open, sun-baked country of the plains and the desert, the first forests of Oregon felt like something from a dream. The trees were enormous. The shade was dense and cool. The air was moist. The transition itself was gradual but unmistakable. Travelers crossing from the dry Snake River plains into the Blue Mountains of eastern Oregon noticed the change first in smaller ways. A few more trees, slightly cooler air, the ground beneath their feet softer and darker than the alkaline dust of the desert behind them. Then, as they descended from the mountains toward the Columbia River and eventually toward the Willamette Valley, the change became dramatic. The forests of western Oregon were unlike anything most of these travelers had ever seen. Douglas fir trees that rose well. Over 100 feet, their trunks wider than a wagon was long. An understory thick with ferns and moss, damp even in summer. The particular green half-light that exists under a dense forest canopy, so different from the unbroken, blinding sun of the plains. For women who had spent 5 months walking through open, sun-exposed country, that first walk into genuine forest shade was, by several accounts, almost overwhelming. The temperature dropped. The light dimmed. The constant wind of the plains was suddenly blocked by trees on every side. Some travelers described an almost dizzying sense of enclosure after so long in open country, though most settled into appreciating the change within a day or two. The Willamette Valley, the destination for most Oregon Trail travelers, is one of the most naturally fertile places in North America. Rich soil, mild climate, plentiful rainfall. The valley sits between two mountain ranges that shelter it, and the same weather systems that keep the coast rainy keep the valley green. Women who arrived in the Willamette Valley in the fall, after starting their journey in Missouri in the spring, had traveled through almost every landscape North America had to offer. Plains, mountains, desert, forest, and then the valley, the Green Valley, the end of the walking, the first night in Oregon. Imagine it. The wagon stopped for the last time in a real way. Not stopped to rest and then go on. Stopped. The fire was started. The beans were put on. The children ran in circles because they were children, and that's what children do. And she sat by the fire. The same fire she'd sat by every night for 5 months. The same coffee pot. The same tin cups. The same smell of wood smoke and salt pork and something warm coming together. But the trees here were different. Fir trees, not cottonwoods. The air smelled different. The ground under her feet was different soil. She was here. After all of it. Here. There's something worth sitting with about that particular moment of arrival, because it didn't necessarily look like triumph from the outside. There was no parade, no fanfare. No one was waiting to celebrate. In most cases, The family simply made camp the way they had made camp every night for 5 months, in a spot that happened to be their actual destination rather than another temporary stop along the way. The emotional reality of that moment, as described in numerous diaries, was often quieter and more complicated than pure celebration. Relief, certainly, the deep relief of having survived a genuinely dangerous undertaking, but also exhaustion so complete that celebration itself felt like too much effort. And, for many, a kind of uncertain anticipation about what came next. The work of building a home from nothing, the work of starting over in an unfamiliar place, far from everyone and everything they'd known before. Some women wrote, with a kind of weary honesty, that the arrival didn't feel as significant in the moment as they'd expected it would. They were too tired to feel much of anything beyond tired. The significance of it, the magnitude of what they'd actually accomplished, often settled in only later, sometimes years later, when they had the distance to look back and understand what they'd done. Underscore. That night, she would have slept deeply, more deeply than she had in months, maybe, with the sound of Oregon rain beginning softly on the canvas overhead. Rain in the Willamette Valley has a sound. It's a soft, steady, patient rain, not violent, not stormy, usually, just present. The kind of rain that fills the rivers and grows the crops and makes everything green. On the canvas of the wagon, soft and steady. A sound that meant, you are here now. This is where you stop. This is home. The rain itself would become, in time, one of the falling on most days during the wettest months, not usually in dramatic downpours, but in the persistent, gray, gentle way that the Pacific Northwest is still known for. For families who had crossed deserts where they prayed for water and rationed every drop, this abundance of rain must have seemed almost unbelievable at first. Some accounts from early settlers describe meant what clothing was needed, how to manage a household where dampness, rather than dust, was the constant background condition, would needed to be kept dry and covered. Clothing took longer to dry after washing. Mud, rather than dust, coated everything during the wet months. But alongside the adjustment came appreciation. The same rain that required adaptation also produced the extraordinary fertility that had drawn these families across the continent in the first place. Crops grew here in a way that many of these families, coming from drier or harsher farming country in the Midwest, had never quite experienced. The soil was deep and rich. The growing season was long. Within a few years, many of these families were producing more food than they had ever managed on their previous farms. Underscore. You are very still now. Your body is heavy. Your breathing is slow. Think about the quilts those women pulled over themselves at night. Made from scraps. Made from pieces of dresses that had worn through at the elbows. from the flannel of a shirt, from the cotton of a Sunday frock that didn't quite survive the journey. Each piece of fabric with its own history, stitched together into something new, something warm. Think of all those women, thousands of them, across all those years, waking before the sun, making the fire, stirring the cornmeal, walking, walking and walking and walking. And then in the evening, the fire again, the beans, the coffee, the children falling asleep, and then the quilt, the dark, the stars, and sleep. Underscore 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 underscore. You don't have to walk anywhere tonight. You don't have to pack anything or carry anything or mend anything or stir anything. The day is done. Whatever you did today, however much or however little it felt like, it was enough. The day is behind you now. There's just this, the quiet, your body at rest, the dark around you. Let your shoulders settle a little further into the mattress. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands, wherever they're resting, go soft and open and heavy. There's nowhere you need to be right now. No fire to tend. No wagon to pack. No miles left to cover before the light comes up. Just this room. Just this bed. Just this quiet. Underscore, 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 underscore. Let's go back to the prairie one more time. In the middle of the night. 2 in the morning, maybe. Or 3. The wagon train is completely still. The fires are down to embers. The oxen are lying down, their enormous bodies at rest. The horses have their heads down. The canvas wagons stand in their circle. The stars are at their highest point now, rotating slowly overhead as the earth turns. The grass moves in the wind. Somewhere in one of those wagons, a woman is sleeping. Her face is relaxed. Her breathing is even. The quilt is pulled up to her chin. Tomorrow will be the same as today. The same fire. The same cornmeal. The same walking. But that's tomorrow. Right now, she's asleep. Deeply, quietly, completely asleep. While the prairie breathes around her. And the stars go on overhead. And the night holds everything still. Let the stillness be yours now, too. The day is done. The work is done. Your body knows how to sleep. It has always known. Let it do what it knows. The grass, the wind, the stars, the quilt, the dark, the quiet. One more breath. In, out. Think of the water. The Platte River running wide and shallow in the moonlight. The surface of it moving, always moving, catching the stars, carrying them downstream. One star, then another, moving slowly, downstream, away. Campfire ember, just one, orange, warm, pulsing very slowly, once, and again, like breathing. Think, just for a little longer, about all the small sounds that filled those nights, because there's something settling about moving through them slowly, one at a time. The faint creak of a wagon while settling slightly on uneven ground, just once, as the night cooled and the wood contracted ever so slightly. The soft shift of a sleeping ox, lying in the grass, breathing its long, slow breaths. The grass itself, endless, moving in a wind too gentle to really call wind, more like the world exhaling. Somewhere, very far off, a sound that might be a coyote or might be nothing at all. Either way, it doesn't matter. It's distant. It's not coming closer. The river, if the camp was near one. That steady, patient rush that never stops, never hurries, never slows down. Just moving, the way it has always moved, the way it will keep moving long after everyone sleeping near it tonight is gone. A child shifting slightly in their sleep, a small sigh, then stillness again. The very faint sound of canvas moving in the air. Almost nothing, just a whisper of fabric. All of these sounds together made up the night. None of them demanding attention, none of them urgent, just present, the way a clock ticking in another room is present, without ever needing you to notice it. You are warm, you are still. The night is long and quiet. There is nothing you need to do, nothing you need to be. Just this, just here, just rest. The meadowlark will sing in the morning. The fire will be coaxed back. The day will begin again. But morning is a long way off. And the night is wide and still and very, very dark. And everything is resting. The grass, the river, the prairie, the stars, and you. And that's the quiet truth of what pioneer women did on the Oregon Trail. Nothing like the movies. We talked about the mornings, the 4 a.m. wake-ups, the fire, the cornmeal mush and the salt pork and the strong, gritty coffee in a tin cup before the sun came up. We talked about the walking, the 10, 12 miles a day, 1 foot and then the other, long skirts in the dust, children needing to be managed, and still more miles ahead. We talked about the work, the mending and the laundry and the medicine and the water management. The invisible work that kept everyone alive and that nobody made a big deal about. Because that was just what you did. We talked about the food, the beans, the cornmeal, the Dutch oven cornbread that was probably the best thing any of them. Ate all day, eaten hot by the evening fire after a long, long walk. We talked about the homes, the wagons that were 4 feet wide and held whole families, the one-room log houses at the end of the journey, the dirt floors swept clean every morning, the candlelight and the firelight and the darkness beyond. We talked about the music, the fiddle by the campfire, the hymns and the folk songs and the dancing when there was energy left to dance. The conversation and the gossip and the letters written home by women who missed their mothers. And we talked about the nights, the banked fire, the stars over the prairie, more stars than most of us have ever seen, the sound of the grass moving in the wind, the river running somewhere nearby, the quilt, the dark, the sleep. These women weren't heroes in the Hollywood sense. They didn't have big dramatic moments that made for good movies. They had something quieter, steadier, more real. They had the patience to do the same necessary things day after day, without recognition, without drama, without anyone clapping at the end. They had the grace of ordinary life. And that, honestly, is the hardest and most beautiful thing there is. So that's the story, the quiet one, the real one, the one that happened in the cracks between all the dramatic stuff, the one that was actually most of the time, most of the days, most of the 2,000 miles. Just real people, doing real things, in real days that were long and repetitive and sometimes hard and sometimes beautiful, just like yours. Sleep well tonight. You've carried enough for one day. Put it down. And that's the quiet truth of what pioneer women actually did all day on the Oregon Trail. Nothing like the movies, just real people, real days, real rest. Sleep well.